Hey guys, welcome to episode 3 of the European Power Rankings. I told you these were going to start coming out thick and fast, and I'm pretty sure there'll be multiple episodes before the end of this week because, yeah, there's plenty of stuff going on. First Strike is certainly over, I don't know what I'm talking about, but Challengers is starting in a couple of weeks, so I imagine some of these teams are literally playing right now in the LVP tournament, but the two that we're going to focus on today is the newly officially announced roster of G2 Esports. First and foremost, before we talk about Zeke and Neil, was David P as much of a problem, Strong, to the point that you feel like a roster move was necessary?
I would say so, yeah. And I think the key thing to understand about this is how G2 put this roster together in the first place. Any roster that was being built in those early days had to, or rather at least should have, been built on the basis of some planned obsolescence. And if you looked at G2, how G2 put together their roster, okay, you've got Mixwell, veteran leader, still, he's like 24, something like that. He's still fairly young, right? But looking like a good player in Valorant, fine. You got literally the best player in Europe, Anderzz, fine. You got Petit Tech, who was very versatile, up-and-coming talent, fine. And then the other two slots were slower, and you got Python, you got David P in the end, right? But these are two older players. They weren't exactly blowing the doors off at any time in beta or early release. They were good players. They were good players, but they were the planned obsolescence. I mean, this was the thing people were saying when, if you remember, the initial rumors were Pyth and David P were gone, and with Pyth it was a case of, well, you should be surprised, but you shouldn't be shocked, because while he has significantly overperformed in that team, it was always the case that it wasn't never boarded down that he was going to be there long term. So that David P was always planned obsolescence. David P was always okay. Go with him. If he surprises us, great. If he doesn't, sure. He was always, like, his success always comes. He's a very one-dimensional player. He was a very he was a good lurker. He was good on the stage. He was good at finding spots when teams weren't particularly counter-striking against them. Just run up into his mid on ascent and get a free K because they've forgotten to keep mid. But as the game progressed, even to the degree, even to the standard of what we've got now, which obviously is far, far below what it can come to be, his style's already been found out. So it makes complete sense that David P was going to go, and it makes complete sense that he has gone because they have found what is legitimately probably been the best free agent in the last 6 months in terms of Zeke.
I think that G2 just played the most terrifying, scrappy. It's interesting because the word I want to use to a pretty large extent is inconsistent, but obviously they were anything but. They were consistent in that they won, but their style was inconsistent in that it was so flexible, malleable, and fundamentals based that they didn't come to matches with these are our book of set plays, you can plan for us. It's we're going to play however the hell we feel we need to in the moment, and we're just going to do it so much better than you that it doesn't matter what you bring to the table. And it got to a point where over time, being that high flexibility sort of non-specialist, that generalist play style is now faltering against more specialized approaches. And so generalism and just being that high fundamentals team worked incredibly well for them for a long time, but I think it's faded quite a bit, and dropping David P is kind of a necessary step in them sort of finding their way into a style, I think, that will define their ability to succeed moving into challengers.
I feel sorry for David P in a sense that he was always a substitute player, it felt like, and it felt that when G2 announced him, it was almost kind of like a roll's eyes, like, all right, we've had him in as a stand-in for so long, I feel like we should announce him and sign him. And you can't really say too much about G2's performance in First Strike or 2020. It was ban on perfect, other than that one game against Heretics. The problem for David P is that he had to fill the role for whatever was needed. In the early days, it was fine to be a Sage player because Sage was meta, the same way that having a Sova is meta, and so many people now are Sova one-tricks to some extent. If Sova gets nerfed or whatever, they could be potentially out of a job, right, if they're not flexible enough. And David P struggled to move over from the Sage to the Breach. He had to IGL at the same time as well because that's what G2 needed. David P would have to be the flexible player because he was, as bad as it sounds, disposable from G2, and I think that's the main thing that happened. What is this style, though, going forward with Zeke? Because pretty much when it comes to agent pool, it's identical to Anderzz. A little bit of a different play style in the sense that Zeke is a bit more aggressive, whereas I feel like Anderzz is very good at picking his moments, both with utility on, say, Silver, for example, but also taking engagements. It's still weird that G2 kind of, when they dropped David P, were like, we need an IGL, we need more of a, not so much a supportive agent player, but more of a supporting role that can help the team orchestrate, leave Anderzz to do what he wants to do, but they have picked up another fragger, much like Mixwell and Anderzz and even Patitech on that team. So why do you think that was?
So, I mean, I think you've kind of hit the nail on the head with regards to, I think it was just best player available. With regards to how Zeke in particular plays, I mean, I watched him a lot, and I think I've been watching for months, because it has, if you really have been watching like the scene, particularly these smaller tournaments, it's been obvious for about 6 months that Zeke was probably going to be one of the number one player you can build around in Europe if you're putting together a new roster, funnily enough. And the reason wasn't because he was incredibly explosive, he was doing things perfectly on one particular playstyle. No, it was because he's incredibly fundamentally sound. He plays aggressively in terms of he's very good at taking space and keeping space. I mean, that was the big difference. If you watch Snow Pinky, what you'll see is, okay, you've got 3 players on that roster who, Aaron, Jesmond, and Vac, who are generally playing quite far back. They weren't taking space too much. Then you had CNED, who, okay, he was moving up, he was making incredibly aggressive peaks, but he was making the peaks for the sake of getting a kill, right? He wasn't getting the peaks for the sake of, okay, I'm going to use that peak, I'm going to take space after it, and the way they was approaching those peaks was obvious, right? But then you had Zeke, and Zeke was just running around with Razor Sova. He was just taking space on the map. He was like moving up somewhere like the one I can remember was from the split game where he on defense he was constantly moving up. He was taking split lobby on that. He was taking the lobby area on A. He was getting that entire site locked down himself because one, because he could bring the threat on it because of how he plays a Razor, but two, just because he was approaching very slowly, very methodically. And there are echoes in his playstyle, I think, we see. And this is kind of the thing. I think they picked him up in terms of being best player available. I don't think they picked him up between IGL. I don't know who's going to IGL on that team. They're probably thinking, well, we don't need a true IGL, which we'll see. But I think that they've picked him up because he's talented, but also because they've seen, well, he has versatility. He has range, right? This is a guy I remember Zeke way back when was playing Cypher on points on those guys. He's a player who, while he hasn't been in a huge amount of games officials, he has showed versatility and he has shown range. And I remember that the thing he was stressing when he was talking, like when he was trying to find himself a team back in August and September, was, okay, I'm versatile. I can play anything, because I think that's the point when playing Jet. So I think that's it. I think it's just a combination of best player available, and they feel like they've got the versatility there. They're not going to be worried about putting him, like finding a role for him and finding 5 roles for the team as a result. The IGL thing, yeah, that's a question. But I think looking at G2 and looking at how G2 have always done things, that's a question mark they're willing to have, I think.
They picked up Zeke because he's got like an incredible breadth to him that almost sort of goes full circle with the point I was making on their style, and you sort of asking what style we think they're going to end up on. I think the whole point in picking up Zeke is that they can go into whatever style they want now. They have a new coach. They have a new player that can function as an IGL if they need it. They've dropped their most bottlenecking player on their roster. They can now decide where they want to go, and they are not handicapped. Their doors are all open. They can figure out where they want to go, and they can feel it out. Whereas prior, there was a very clear impediment in their roster that limited their options, and that no longer exists.
Especially from an aggressive perspective, right? Now you have Mixwell, Anderzz, and Zeke as this terrible trio that can almost function much like TSM did way back when you had Sub Rosa, Wardell, and Drone acting as the 3 aggressors. And we sort of highlighted this a little bit with Giants, and the playstyle, the meta that's forming is you have the controller, the sentinel, but then you have a Silver and then the Raze typically, and then a Jet. So you have this double duelist with a Silver setting it up. That's a comp, much like you're sort of suggesting, that G2 can now run and actually probably pound for pound be one of the stronger teams when it comes to those players within those roles. David P, he'd have to either play Silver or Raze or whatever, and I think that would have been certainly lacking at that level. But I think the more interesting thing about how well G2 Esports can do is the signing of a coach like Neil Zenio. And I feel like there was a really good example of this in First Strike on that Ascent map that we mentioned before, where at that point Mike's was the coach for that team, helping them out. There was a tactical timeout called because I think it was David P or just G2 generally were pushing aggressively on the defense and getting caught out by Heretics just waiting for them. Tactical timeout was called out. He says this in an interview too, so this isn't just gossip, where he said, stop doing that, be a bit more patient, let Heretics come to you. They did that for one round, it worked out super well, and then the round afterwards, they started pushing on the defense, getting picked off. So I do feel like when it comes to a team that if I was a coach and I was offered the position of, I don't know, the teams that we have in this ladder right now, G2 would probably be a team that I would be scared to coach for, because the setup of that team, the individuals that they have, you have to get them on board to listen to you, and I think that would be even hard. Even with an IGL, if you throw Angel in this roster, I think there's a strong chance that Angel is the first player to leave if things go wrong, because much like in Counter-Strike, it's very easy to scapegoat those players that have more of a commanding role. Whereas Neil, because he has such a good rapport with artists from previous times, I do feel like he has a lot more authority in this roster, that what he says will be listened to. I'm not necessarily saying that G2 say that about Mike's, for example, but I'm curious about you guys from like your analyst and coaching background. It must be difficult to be in a team like that and try to go, listen to me, these are the strategies that we're running.
I've jokingly said this in like private conversations a couple times, and it's been quite far back at this point, that of all of the like high performing tier 1 teams in the world, G2 is on my short list of ones that I would be the least interested in coaching, because it looks like nightmare fuel. The amount of poignant, opinionated players on that roster, I feel like you would have to be a very special kind of coach to not just get cannibalized. And even then, I think that the way you don't get cannibalized is by accepting the fact that the extent of your reach and power in that roster is going to be far lesser than it would be in a lot of other situations. You have to be very prescient and aware of the players that you are working with, the extent to which you will be able to influence them effectively, and instead of sort of being that iron fist, you are going to have to play more of a guiding force in that setting, and that makes it extremely challenging if you don't know very explicitly what you're signing up for.
As a coach, I've been on teams with similar mix of personalities, and it is absolute bloody hell if you're not prepared to deal with it. And I mean, the big thing to understand when you're coaching a team like this is you are going to have to talk and talk and talk and talk your ass off, because every single idea you have, every single thing you try and implement, you're going to have to convince those players like 10 times over. It's been one of those cases where it's one of those cases where you're not coaching them. So like, what you're doing in practice sessions is like 25% of the battle. The other 75% is you have to just hammer it into them over and over and over. You have to have that conversation with them over and over and over again. I mean, the example I always remember hearing about was from League was Prolly. Like Prolly was basically doing like 100 hours a week working with H2K, which had a notoriously difficult lineup. But he was doing like 100 hours a week coaching. He was doing like 30 hours of scrims or whatever, and the other 70 hours were talking to the players to try and say it to them over and over again, like about how you thought about it this way, or you consider this. Like just every social interaction you have with the team becomes part of trying to convince them to do things. So I mean, I have to imagine Neil knows what you're getting in for. Regards, if you're a certain type of coach and you have that personality where that meshes well with how you work, that meshes well with how you want to work, then great. I mean, it's one of those cases where you can't have like a authoritarian coach in that team, obviously. But yeah, it's going to be a challenge for him. But I've only heard good things, so we'll see.
With all of this said, where did G2 land for you guys post first strike? They've only lost one best of 3 through the 6, 7, 8 months that these guys have been together. It's the first best of 3 that Anderzz ever lost within Valorant. Do you still rate them, or after first strike, I must add, did you rate them as still like a top 2 team in the region, top 3? I feel like they had been slipping, but you can't argue with the results. G2 were the best team in Europe for 2020, up until that final one.
I still think that you would be absolutely off your rocker to place them outside of top 3. And I think that the most powerful argument is that they're still the best team in the region, especially with the change that they made. I think post first strike, you drop them from like first to third, and then they announced the Zeke change, and you immediately put them back to first.
That's exactly how I see it as well, basically. I think they were... Yeah, I mean, post first try, I don't think you could put them any below anybody except FPX and Tactics. And with the Zeke change, obviously a lot's going to have to play out here still, but I think they're better. Like the only one I think was even in question would they might be better than is FPX, and I do think they're better than FPX. So
100%, I agree. FPX has sort of failed to put up results. The meme about them at this point is like, oh, everyone says they'll be fantastic, but have they managed to win anything yet? And I mean, it's a valid criticism. And when you look at G2, they've not only won a ton of stuff, but they've only recently faltered. And as soon as we saw them falter, they brought in something that on its face should be quite literally the best solution to that issue that existed in availability. Like, there is no player they could have picked up in Europe that was a better replacement for this slot, in my opinion. Straight up.
And a coach as well. Like, I think both the moves, it was just like the two common things that were brought up. And what is the problem with this G2 esports roster then? Because I think FPX, you mentioned it, they haven't won anything. It's very hard to argue for a team to be number one. But I still feel almost uncomfortable to put G2 on top. And I'm not really sure if I can put my finger on why. Mostly because, I guess, the new changes, but also how are they going to react now that they aren't necessarily confirmed the best team in Europe after losing First Strike?
So this is where that league analogy comes in, is that you almost have to believe in the magic a little bit of what G2 does. Like, I agree with you that there's something a little bit intangible there. Like, you almost have a lingering fear that, like, okay, you brought into the team a coach which fixes one of your major problems. You brought in a hyper broad, like, high caliber player to fill in your biggest compositional bottleneck. So now you have all of the tools to succeed. You just have to actually do it. And there's this lingering fear that, like, well, maybe they don't do it. Like, they have all of the tools, but that doesn't mean that they use them effectively. But you have to trust that they will, because the organization has always done it. If you look at League of Legends, they have this, like, meme approach to the game where they don't pick up role players. They pick up just the raw, mechanically scariest people in their region. They're like, you're playing this role now. Good luck, have fun. And it works. They beat everyone. It defies logic. And it encapsulates, I mean, I use the word magical repeatedly because that's what it is. It's like this intangible, ridiculous, counterintuitive thing that just works. And you just have to give them the benefit of the doubt.
Yeah, it feels like G2 came into this sort of off-season, if you could call it that, wanted to get milk and eggs with an IGL, and they came back with an AK-47 in Zeke. That it wasn't necessarily what they wanted, but you aren't really going to argue the results when it comes to firepower. So I do think it looks like we're putting G2 at the top of this list, at least at this point. But looking at the teams we still have to be added, I think it's fair to say that G2 are looking to be the top team of these rankings going into Challengers. What is it that we're looking out for? What are the signs that this team is going to do well? Or what are the first signs of seeing, oh no, this is not going as we all hoped?
If they come into the first events of Challengers and they are running a composition that looks even marginally similar to what they were running at the end of First Strike, all hands abandon ship. Like, that is a very, very big red flag. I don't see a universe where they're like, hey, Zeke, you know what you're going to play now? Sage. Like, I don't see that happening in any universe. But hypothetically, that would be the sort of thing. Like, it would have to be a very egregious and blatant mistake in terms of the way that they decide to approach the game. I think that in terms of where there's smoke, there's fire type of things, in terms of them being successful. So the inverse is if they come out and they put Zeke on Raze, they have Artis on Sova, they have Mixwell on Jet, they keep Pat on Smokes, and they have Pith on Sentinel. I think if that comp comes out of the gate in Challengers, everyone should be terrified.
Yeah, nobody matches up.
You have to run. That is how terrifying that team is. Good luck.
What else about G2 do they have over FPX, if anything? Because I don't think, we're putting G2 over FPX because they actually won stuff is enough of a reason, considering how close FPX have been. What did G2 have that FPX don't?
On like a really, really like nitty-gritty analysis level, I think that their mid-rounds are just better. I think that the fact, and this is a really sort of interesting abstract rabbit hole to go down. I think the fact that they lack a concrete individual IGL actually plays into their favor in this extent, because instead of having a core IGL, they have multiple what I refer to as idea guys on the team who are all spitballing constantly throughout a round, and that's where their dynamism comes from. And because of that dynamism, I think their mid rounds can be orders of magnitude scarier than FPX's. I think FPX's overarching macro strategy is way more sound, and it's proven by the plays and the execs that Angel puts together. But I think in terms of adaptability and that inter-round finesse, G2 has an edge.
So yeah, I mean the short, the very very short version is just the firepower on G2 is just beyond anything we could possibly ever see in a game's lifetime at this point compared to the competition. Right? It was definitely the case during Ignition series, might be the case now even. But that's the ultimate thing. Like it should be emphasized. If you haven't seen much of Zeke, he is legitimately at least a top 10 player in the region.
Yes,
probably higher.
He has such a long tail of potential that's another thing is he's the type of player that, like, he could be, I mean, only League players will get this analogy, but he could be the G2 perks of Valorant. Like, he could have a multi-year franchise-defining role in this team.
He's an era player.
Yeah.
I feel like when you look at G2 and FPX, you've got FPX that are like this full orchestra where everything's to a T. It sounds amazing when it all comes together. G2 are jazz band. When a string snaps, one team is going to do a lot better than the other when it comes to adapting, and that to me is what G2 are so good at. There's no excuse for G2 to not be the best team in Europe at this point. I think that the loss of David P has helped them out. It's freed them up a little bit in regards to flexibility, but they've also brought in another world-class player that's on the level of Anderzz. Mixwell I'm not as sure on when it comes to how much of a star he is, but Anderzz especially, Patitech is very good in his role and also very flexible. If you want him to play Phoenix, he can and will. Who at this point now is a player that you look at and go, okay, now you need to perform, otherwise you're getting the boot? Is it Pyth or Piff even?
It is Pyth, but it should really be Mixwell, I think.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think that people will go after Pith next, but I think that Mixwell is the more egregious of the two. I think that Mixwell has a certain amount of like brand power behind him, and his role is the fluffiest in terms of you can get away with being slightly below the pinnacle on it when you're on a roster like G2's. Like, he can afford to not be the highest fragging, most mechanically gifted primary op in the region because he has Anderzz and Zeke on his team now. Like, he doesn't need to be the best. He can just be one of the best and still get away with it.
His stats in First Strike were pretty good. Even on Raze, which was probably the most surprising thing about G2, is that Mixwell came into that role moving away from the Jet for maps like Split, I think, and maybe even Bind. Off the top of my head, I can't necessarily remember, but the main thing is that Anderzz, who used to play Raze for this roster on those kind of maps and away from the Sova, moved on to Breach when he had to change off of his main agent, right? So I think the Mixwell was pretty impressive in regards to stats across two different agents. Why would he then be a problem now? Just because he now has two players on his team that could potentially be better than him. I know Sliggy jokes that people are on about, like, oh, is Mixwell the best opper in Europe, in the world? And Sliggy's like, he isn't even the best opper on G2 because it's Anderzz.
Yeah. Well,
and he's got a point.
That is literally the point. That is entirely the point. Is that meme from Sliggy is 100% true. Like, Mixwell genuinely isn't even the best opera on his team. If someone tries to belabor and argue that point with me, sure, let's have at it, because you'll lose. Like, he genuinely isn't even the best opera on his team. And that's the problem, is there are better primary operas in Europe, arguably a handful of them. And I think with, in Pith's case, that is far less the case. Like, are you probably going to target him because he has less brand power than Mixwell, and because if you start faltering a bit, you're going to want to make a change on the lineup?
And let's be honest, Piff is probably going to be bottom fragging in some of those games too. And
exactly,
that's just the typical thing.
But here's the challenge with that. Who are you going to replace him with? Meadows already moved to another team. Par is on Heretics. Fecu is already going elsewhere. Like, all right, who's next up? Are you gonna poach from Forza? Like, where do you go next? Like, what's your top 10 Sentinel players exactly? Because the reality is like, what's the alternative to Pith? He genuinely doesn't have a bunch of alternatives. You say that about Mixwell, I could give you 3 guys right now that you would probably sign and be perfectly okay with. 2 of them are under the radar enough that I'm not gonna put them on blast. But I would pick up CNED tomorrow over Mixwell and be very happy with my decision.
Closing thoughts and Strong for G2. We've put them as the top team in this region. Do you feel like they're still the kings? How long will that reign last? What do you have to say about this G2 esports being the best team in Europe going into? I feel dirty for saying it, but I do genuinely think in this case, they have done such a good job to put them back in pole position.
I think it's entirely merited, and the proof will be in the pudding at the end of the day, right? It will be how they do in contenders. It'll be, but if I'm a betting man, right, I'm taking a bet on G2 being the top team after Contenders 1 and after Contenders 2 at this point, 100%. Like there's just so much talent on that lineup, and it's just so much multi-dimensional talent. I think that's the thing that always to stress with it. Like people kind of got the wrong idea about Anderzz at first. Like, Anderzz is just the all-round game of Anderzz is ridiculous. The all-round game of Zeke is ridiculous.
I think he is the most complete player in the world, honestly.
Yeah. So they should be able to find a way to win, and if they can't, God knows what's going on. Heavy is the head that wears the crown.
Exactly, and I think that's very much G2. It has been G2 across different games, but the roster that they have, the upgrades that they've made, literally every single complaint in regards to the roster, the structure, the lineup of this G2 roster has been completely answered to a point where all 3 of us are very satisfied to put them at the top. I know that it's the typical thing of like G2 number 1 in Europe. Genuinely this time, they should be. And I think the should has to be emphasized because Lord knows there's about half a dozen teams that are coming for them. And I do think that our opinions might very easily change if things don't start to go the way of G2 esports. But we have put them as the top team within this ranking. There are plenty of other teams to go over, not only the small ones from various regions, but some names that aren't even on this list to be added. So be sure to check out those videos as they come along, and we'll see you then. Take care.